So as we said, we are in Romans chapter 13. This will be our third study on this section of Romans. I appreciate the elders allowing us to go in depth into these verses. As we've said before, I think that this is a timely study for us, especially in the current situation that we find ourselves in here in the country, both with mandates being made to do certain things in reference to the virus, as well as some of the social issues that have been coming up and some responses to those social issues. And oftentimes we as Christians find ourselves wondering exactly where do we fit in all of this. And so I do appreciate the opportunity of being able to go in depth into these verses. I appreciate the feedback that I have received from several here, the questions, the comments, the advice as far as how to approach a subject from and just different viewpoints. And I would have to say that I think I've learned some things in my study of these verses, and I hope that as we've meditated upon these things, that you have come away with a better understanding of the first 7 verses of Romans chapter 13. And so last week we dealt a good portion of the class. We dealt with the idea of a Christian serving in a government, whether it's elected official or just an appointed position. And I thought that was a very good thing for us to look at. And we spent a good bit of time dealing with that. And so this week we're going to kind of pick back up in with our verses, sort of finish up the first 5 or so verses there. I hope to have some practical applications the last part of the class as far as protesting and things of that nature. I'm not really certain that we're going to get done this week, especially with those last couple of verses as far as dealing with taxes and things like that. I have a feeling that we're not going to get there. So, but I do want to make some practical applications because I believe there are some very practical things we need to be considering right now in just things we do every day and the reactions and the conversations that we are having with others. And so I think we need to be looking at that and considering that and looking at our position as a Christian in this time and what we need to be doing and the face that we need to be showing and the attitude that we need to have. And so before we begin, I think we need to go ahead and read those first 7 verses just to kind of set the stage for our study again. So Romans chapter 13, beginning with verse 1, it says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. For if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs are due, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." And so we began a couple of weeks ago looking at the rule. The rule is stated 2 times in this passage. It's stressed twice by Paul. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. We see that in the very beginning there in verse 1. He then again kind of reiterates this in verse 5. Therefore, you must be subject. And so really there is very clear our position to the governing authorities. We are to be in subjection to the governing authorities. And then we looked at the reason. Why are we to be in subjection to the governing authorities? Well, first and foremost, the governing authorities were appointed by God. They were put there by God, and therefore we need to be subject to them. And so to resist the government is to resist God. And that is a very important point that we need to recognize. Whenever we have any interaction with the government, whether great or small, to resist the government is to resist God. And this is the rule. We need to understand that. The government is a minister of God designed to avenge evil. And certainly there are exceptions to that rule. We looked at last week how that Paul himself had experienced exceptions to that rule. That he had been on the side of the government where he was mistreated unjustly. And even before he had written this, there had been occasions where that had been the case. Yet, even though he had experienced that, he is still writing verses 1 and verses 5 where he is commanding us as Christians to be subject to the governing authorities. And so even though there are exceptions to this rule, we must be subject. Obedience to the government keeps us from experiencing the government's wrath. And again, there are exceptions. But the rule is that if we obey the government, then we won't experience the government's wrath. We were talking last week about speeding fines. How that if we keep our speed under the speed limit, we don't have to worry about speeding tickets. If we pay our taxes and we do not try to cheat on our tax returns, we don't have to fear that audit that may come from the IRS. And so obeying the government keeps us from experiencing the government's wrath. But yet the Christian's reason for doing that goes beyond that. We do it for the sake of our conscience, for conscience sake. We do it because it's right. Whether or not we are going to get caught, whether or not we are going to get fined or put in jail or whatever, we are going to obey God and we're going to obey the law because that's what God has wanted us to, what He has commanded us to do. To be subject to the authorities, to be respectful, and to obey the law. So if there's a situation where, it would be of some gain to us if we cheated or if we broke the law and there's really no way we would ever get caught, as a Christian, we're not going to do that. We're going to uphold the law no matter the situation. And then, this is pretty well where we got here. We were going to look again at what Peter said there in 1 Peter. We read that a couple of times in our previous studies. But Peter gives two reasons for obeying the rulers. The first one being, well, let's just read that. For this is the will of God, that by doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. So first and foremost, we obey the rulers because this is the will of God. This is the will of God. Also for the Lord's sake. 1 Peter 2 and verse 13, if you back up a couple of verses there. And so Peter says we obey the rulers because we obey God. The second reason is that we may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Oftentimes here in the first century, the Christians were often accused of owing a higher allegiance to this heavenly king. And sometimes they were brought before civil rulers and said, hey, they have this other king, they're trying to set up this other king other than you. And so there was a lot of times where opponents of Christianity were trying to blur the lines there. And so it seems here that Peter is stating that you need to be sure to respect governing authorities, that we may put to silence those who are trying to accuse us of doing things that we are not guilty of. And so it's very important that you are sure that you obey the governing authorities. And so this is something that Peter thought was important. By doing good, by submitting, we can silence, or this word literally means to muzzle the ignorant charges that are being brought up against us. And so this was applicable there in the first century. I can see where this in the future would be applicable to us, where we need to be sure that we are doing everything as properly as we can in a respectful way, so that we can maybe fight some ignorant accusations that are being thrown at us. And so there are reasons why we do this. And so now we've looked at the rule, we've looked at the reasons why we do this. Let's look at the exception. What's the exception to this rule? Well, first and foremost, it's not when the government is oppressive. It seems like in our country we've enjoyed so many freedoms over the last couple of centuries that we have become spoiled and our way of thinking in a lot of ways has kind of shifted from, from centered on the Bible to centered on my freedoms as a citizen. And we feel like that a government that is oppressive, we have the right to go against that government. That government is sinful, and therefore we have the right, or the requirement to do that. We're required to do that. But that's not the case. You look at the governments, again, we in our very first lesson, we looked at the government that Paul was writing under. Very oppressive government. The type of government that none of us here have had the misfortune to live under. But yet Paul was stating there to be in subjection to that. And so we need to really get that in our minds. No matter how oppressive our government is, until it conflicts with God's Word, we are to be in subjection. No matter what mandates are thrown down, no matter what taxes are imposed, no matter what freedoms are taken away, until it conflicts with what God has told us to do, we have no right to go against that. And so that's a very important point. Paul and Peter, according to secular history, were eventually martyred for their belief. They were eventually killed by these governments that they were telling these early Christians to be in subjection to. And so they were willing to do that, to suffer death, and yet be in subjection. So these men were not writing from some protected place. They were very vulnerable in their position, and ultimately were killed because of it. And so we need to understand that, and we need to understand our position as a Christian. And so the only exception is we must obey God rather than men. And so we see this illustrated a couple of times in the book of Acts, one of them being Acts chapter 4, verses 18 through 20. It says, "So they called them and commanded them not to speak at all, nor teach in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered and said to them, Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge, but we cannot speak the things which we have seen and heard." And so basically, they are being called there, and Peter and John there answered and said, we're going to obey God rather than you. And we see, in this exchange between Peter and John and these rulers, we really don't see anything disrespectful. We don't see them spitting in their face. We don't see them calling them names. We don't see them trying to organize any sort of riot or anything like that to forcibly pull these men from their position. They just simply say, we're going to obey God rather than you. And I think it's important that we notice that as well. We have another example in Acts chapter 5, verses 27 through 29. It says there, "And when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, Did we not strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood on us." But Peter and the apostles answered and said, "We ought to obey God rather than men." So there we have the exception. We have the civil government trying to impose things on a Christian that goes against what God has stated that they must do. They're trying to restrict the teaching of the gospel. And so here we have these men, these very brave men, in a respectful manner, telling these civil officials, we are going to obey God rather than you. And they lived that. They lived that from this point on, as far as being beaten, being jailed, being eventually killed. But yet we see nothing that's disrespectful, nothing that goes against anything other than that specific thing that the government had restricted that they ought to have done because of their religious beliefs. When the government tries to force us to disobey God, we must disobey the government. Even then, the only law that we have the right to disobey is just the one that goes against God. As we said, these men didn't go out and start breaking other laws because they were forced to break one. They were only going against the government in that singular instance. And only in the instance that goes against God. We don't see them going out breaking other laws. And so I think that's important for us to understand. We have no scriptural authority for general civil disobedience in response to injustice. No authority whatsoever. And again, we see the apostles time and time again submitting to unjust punishments and even death for the cause of Christ. And so we have the rule. We have the reason for the rule, and then we have the exception for the rule. And so now we're going to kind of get into some practical applications for us. Before we get into that, does anybody have any comments or anything they would like to make before we get to maybe some things that we need to consider for us today? Okay, I'd like to go in and begin with protesting as a Christian. As a Christian, what should my view be on protesting? Can I protest scripturally? How far can I go? Can I be among these crowds that we see? And as we said, I think this is very important. I think it's an important question that our young people have as they move off and go into the institutions of higher education, because a lot of times that's where we see many of these protests centering in our college campuses. And so we need to understand what is our position when it comes to protesting as a Christian. And so I would like to begin with by looking at ways that I know that I can protest. Things I can do in protest to injustice and protest to sin that's being promoted even by our government. And the first thing I can do is protest with prayer. We have not only the right, I believe we have the commandment, the requirement as Christians to begin by protesting with prayer. One of the very first things that you and I should be doing in any time of trouble, any time of social upheaval, just any time, even when it's good, is to be going to God in prayer. 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 through 3. We read this a couple of weeks ago. Therefore, I exhort, first of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior. So here we have the express commandment that we are to be praying for our rulers. We are to be praying for our rulers in particular that we as Christians can lead a quiet and peaceable life. And so there we have, this statement. And not only does it portray, maybe a little bit on our attitude toward the government, but it kind of gives us an image of the life that as Christians we should be living. What sort of life? Quiet and peaceable. Not riotous and loud. Right? This is the life we should be praying to God that we would be able to live. And so we need to consider that as well. This is our prayer. I want, as a Christian, to live a quiet and peaceable life. This is what I'm asking God. If we have not prayed about it, we certainly have no business to take to social media talking about it. We have no business taking to protest in any town whatsoever, in any form, if we have not first gone to God in prayer. No matter what it is. No matter No matter if it's a peaceful protest or whatever we're posting on Facebook or Instagram or anything, we need to pray first. We need to pray first. What does the last part of James 5 and verse 16 say? The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Do you believe that verse? If we say, yes, I believe that verse, then what is the best thing we can do? It's to pray. The Bible tells us that this is going to avail much. This is going to do some good. And so this is where we should go first. We should go to God in prayer. Because God has said this is going to do some good. We can protest by example. Protest by example. One of the very best things I think we can do to change the world is be a good example. Start with me. I need to start right here. How do I interact with other people? How do I view people of other races? How do I view authority? I need to start with me, and I need to make sure my interaction with all of these things that we are protesting is where it needs to be. And the kindness that I show to other people can do much more good than any amount of yelling and screaming and sign holding that I can do in any public way. I believe. You look at 1 Timothy chapter 2. I'm sorry, 1 Timothy chapter 4. In verse 12. Let no one despise your youth, but be an example in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. Young people, do you want to be taken seriously? I remember back when I was a young person, I wanted to be taken seriously by adults. Ask yourself, do you want to be taken seriously? 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12 says, act like somebody that can be taken seriously. Conduct yourself in a way that you can be taken seriously. What was Paul telling Timothy? You know, in your words, in your conduct, in your love, in your spirit, in your faith, in your purity, conduct yourself in all of these areas in a way that's fitting. And don't give anybody any reason to despise you as a young person. You want to make a difference? Act like somebody. Act like somebody. And you can make a difference. The interaction you have with the dozens of people. Think about how many people we come in contact with every day. You know, sometimes, people, if you stay at home, maybe you don't have contact with that many people, but on social media you probably do, if you're on social media. But those of us who are out in the world, coming in contact with people at the service stations, at restaurants, where we work at, just people on the sidewalk, how many people do we come in contact with a day? And therefore, we have those opportunities, those interactions to make good impressions, to do good things for others. And being good in those situations, again, I think will have much more impact, really, than any mass protest. If you want to have an impact as an individual, go to the individuals. I think that's where it's at. Titus 2, verses 6 through 8. Likewise, exhort the young men to be sober-minded, in all things showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say to you. Think about it, young people, young men, young women. You're going up against an opponent. And this opponent may be more educated. They may be older than you. They may have a bigger following. But yet, if you're showing integrity, if you're showing reverence and corruptibility, if your speech is sound, ultimately, what will you do? You will put that person to shame. When we look at the young people today in these mass demonstrations, do we see that pattern being put forth? I don't believe we do many times. And so we need to be very careful about going and taking part in something that's going to put us in a different category. Jeremy and I, and I'm sure he's got some comments he would like to make as well, but we were talking a couple of weeks ago, and one of the points that I've really thought about since our conversation is the idea that when we are going out and we are doing these things, we're being put in categories. The world is putting us in a category. We're on this side or we're on that side. But as Christians, we have a category we must be in. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But we want to be in this category. The category of Titus chapter 2, verses 6 and 8. As a young person, that's the category you want to be in. And so if you're going to be putting yourself in a position that's going to take you out of that category, I don't think you need to be there. I think we need to be very careful. The next thing we need to do is protest with propriety. We need to be protesting with propriety. Any protest that we engage in must be done in a way that sets us apart from those who do not know God and do not follow God. As we said, we must be set apart from those people. We don't want to be put in that category with this group of people who do not follow God, who do not know God, who blatantly disregard God's Word. We can't put ourselves in with those people. The vast majority of protests we see today are organized by those who have no regard for God, no respect for authority, no respect for scriptures and passages such as Romans chapter 13. We see it by the things they are doing. We see it by the speeches that are being made, the chants that are being yelled, the signs that are being held. We see it all over. And so we must take ourselves away from that. We simply cannot blend our voices with people who engage in such tactics. Ephesians 5 and verse 11, have no fellowship. No fellowship. Not some fellowship, not fellowship when we think it's promoting a good cause, not fellowship when there's injustice. What does it say? No fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 22, do not lay hands on anyone hastily, nor share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. So as a Christian, can I go to these modern protests and keep myself pure? I'm not so sure I can. I personally have not seen video footage or pictures or anything like that of a protest that I personally could feel like I could attend and keep myself pure. And keep myself away from these other things. As we said, we are put into a category when we attend a protest. And we cannot allow ourselves to be put in a category with the world. 1 Peter 2 and verse 9, we read this last week, maybe the week before, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, His own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. This is our category. Our category is this here. This is where you and I need to be. We can't be lulled out of that category. We can't be jerked out of that category. We can't be forced out by the government. We can't be forced out by a group of people, a mob. We can't be forced out of this category. This is where we must stay. My next comments, I want to say very careful. Because I wholly, with all my heart, believe that Black Lives Matter. I have no problem whatsoever with that statement. I understand and I believe that all lives can't matter until black lives matter. I get it and I believe it. I want to promote that sentiment because my black brothers and sisters, they matter. All the other black people in North, everybody matters just as much as I do. And I need to love them. I need to respect them. And that statement I have no issue with whatsoever. I cannot, however, support the organization Black Lives Matter. I can't do it. As an organization, it was founded by some very wicked people. And so if you can go on to the Black Lives Matter website, blacklivesmatter.com, and you can go to the What We Believe, and you're going to read things like this. This is a direct quote, copied and pasted from their website. It says, end quote, "We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable." And so what we have here is their attempt to disrupt God's plan for the family. We want to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family. That nuclear family, mother, father, children, children respecting parents, things of that nature. We want to do away with that. I can't support that. I just can't. You go down a little further. Again, quote, "We make space for transgender brothers and sisters to participate and lead. We are self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege and uplift black trans folk, especially black trans women who continue to be disproportionately impacted by trans antagonistic violence." So now they're supporting homosexual rights, homosexuality, upholding that, lifting that up, promoting that. They go on to state, "We foster a queer affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual unless he or she or they disclose otherwise." And so I can't support that. As a Christian, I have the command to have no association with evil. And so when I go to a rally or to a protest that's being organized by people of the Black Lives Matter movement, when I'm holding up a sign that says hashtag Black Lives Matter, when I'm doing all of those things, I'm supporting this organization. I'm associating myself with this organization. And while I believe that black lives do matter, I can't support this. And so when we go to a protest, and we're going right along with all of these people that support all of these things, we are having association with unfruitful things. And I can't do that. And so we need to be very, very careful. No, I cannot allow myself to be put in that category with them. Even in a nonviolent, peaceful protest where there's no disrespect for any civil authority, no laws being broken, I cannot lend my support to those who are going to be supporting this agenda. I just can't do it. And so we need to be very, very careful. We can protest by abstaining. If there is a company or an organization which supports or engages in behavior that is unjust or wrong, we have the right to withhold our patronage. We can have no association with them. We can no longer buy their products. We can withdraw our memberships. We can get rid of the products that we already own that were made by these people. We can protest by abstaining. We don't have to support them. And we can do that. And maybe in some instances, I think we may be called upon to do that. And, we could get in deeper with that, which I'm not going to take the time to do that, but that is, I believe, a logical reaction to injustice, to things being promoted that go against our beliefs as Christians. So we can protest by abstinence, by abstaining. And then finally, I believe that as a Christian, we can protest with very careful participation. I see no issue with a protest that is carefully orchestrated. But, in my opinion, it would have to be small because you start getting larger and it's going to get out of control. But this idea of holding a sign up on the corner, maybe you and your spouse or somebody else, something like that, something respectful that you could do, I think that we would have the authority to do that. You look, as noted earlier in our first lesson, Paul used the law to his advantage. A couple of different instances we saw where he used the law to promote what he was trying to do. And so I think we have the authority to do that today. Under the United States Constitution, it allows us to protest in a peaceful manner. As long as we've got the proper permits, as long as we are doing it peacefully, we're not breaking the law, we are allowed to protest in a peaceful manner. I think, we talked about Daniel a couple of weeks ago and how that he had gone and he had respectfully asked to eat different food than all the other young men there. And in a way, that was a protest, but it was a very respectful protest. It was one that was done, with propriety. And so I think we have scriptural basis to do things such as that. But any protest that we attend must be guided by the Scripture. There can be no violence whatsoever. There can be no disrespect to any government leaders, no calling names, no calling for someone to be forcibly removed, nothing like that. We can't be doing that. There can be no civil disobedience, no breaking of the laws. If we're told to disband, we must disband. If we're told not to protest in that area, but this area over here, we must go there. There should be love and compassion shown for all parties, even those who may be in the wrong, even the person that may have murdered the other person. We're told to love our enemies. There must be love and compassion for everyone. There can be no hateful speech or chants. And there can be no support shown for organizations which promote evil. Have you seen a protest like that in recent days? I don't think I have. There may have been some. I'm not saying there weren't some. But I don't think I have seen one, personally. So, as a Christian, I think we need to be very, very careful. I've got some other things, but I want to open it up. We don't have a lot of time. Does anybody have anything that they would like to say, disagree with, maybe?
Shane, I'll say something real brief. Since I said that based on Paul having right as a Roman citizen to appeal to the law, that we would have the right to appeal to the law and that we could protest. I left that open-ended,
Yeah.
And I think you know me well enough that I would not think we have the right to join in to these mass protests that you have condemned and shown. I think a verse that would be very helpful in supporting what you've said is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23. Paul says there, all things are lawful to me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful to me, but all things edify not.
Yes, it's a good passage.
Shane, I was thinking about joining the military. It seems like to me all these things apply the same way. You see, you're in a group, you lost control, you're in it, you have to be obedient, and you just totally, and your group with a group, they're for killing enemies. So it seems like to me it's the same thing. It's
Yeah.
down the
I
line.
believe that's well, there's other reasons, but that would be a good one. I think so.
Shane, we have a responsibility not only collectively as a church, as when you talk, like the Thessalonians, they sounded forth the word. They were known for doing so. And you look at Acts 8, where Christians were scattered, they went everywhere, men and women went preaching the word. So on your part of your list, could include that our responsibility, the way that we protest, because this is done no matter what the circumstance.
Yeah.
That we preach the gospel. And unfortunately, as you said, when you protest with the world, really that's what it is, you're viewed as supporting a side. They don't see otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
They're not concerned about the small ins and outs of your stance. They see you as supporting Black Lives Matter in today's situation. If they see you supporting the police, if you support the police, you don't support others. That's how they look at you. That's how they view you. And you don't get a chance to say, no, I just stand for the truth. They're not standing for the truth. They have an agenda. They have a side that they want to support. But as a Christian, you don't get a chance to voice that. When you're standing there with the mob of people.
Yeah.
And in Rodney's words, I think it hurts our influence. And it does. You can't stand with the side and then try to preach to the other side later. It won't happen. It won't work.
Yeah.
So that's the crux of my argument. No matter what it is, our responsibility is to preach the gospel. And that's how we should be known for that amongst our circle of friends, people at work. They should know where we stand on anything because we don't believe in murder. See, they should know where I stand.
Yeah.
If an officer kills a person, black or white, and it's deemed as murder, well, they know where I stand on that.
Yeah. I don't know if you or somebody else had made the statement to me, but if the people around us don't understand where we stand on those issues, then we're failing as a Christian. It should be very evident already before any of this goes on. Where we stand on injustice, where we stand on murder, where we stand on brutality, everybody should know that because we preach, we teach.
And you're not seeing them a lot, Matthew 5, that we're the light of the world.
Yeah.
You're not the light of the world when you're standing there with a bunch of worldly people while they're yelling and saying things and doing things that are wrong, which eventually they're going to get to that anyway. It may not start off that way.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good chance you're going to end up that way.
Yeah, there's a good chance. And, Brandy was reading an article. She read it, some of it to me last night, talking about how that, we're taught that we shouldn't follow the world. And if you've got these masses of worldly people going in this direction, and we find ourselves in them, then we're in the wrong spot if we're following the masses.
And that's possible. I want people to understand that's my view. Like, it shouldn't, it's unfortunate that we have to talk about it, that people have different stances on it. But as Christians, we should know. We're just preaching the word. We're just doing what the Bible tells us to do. It don't matter what happens around us. Our primary responsibility is to do the things that God has commanded and instructed us. And that's our influence. It doesn't matter what happens around us.
Yeah.
That's what we do from day to day.
Yeah, that's true.
Life.
Very true. Anything else anybody would like to say before we close up? Again, we're going to extend this, if the elders are okay with it, for another week. And next week, I'm going to kind of go to the other and look at some of the issues with maybe some of the more conservative way of thinking and, things of that nature. Because there again, as we've said, we don't need to be a Democrat or Republican. We need to be a Christian. And there are some things going on this conservative side that are clearly against the Scripture. And so we're going to look at that next week, show some very recent personal examples to me, things that I've seen, things that people have said to me and to Brandy, and look at those and just say, how as a Christian do we react to this? Because I think it's important for us to find our footing and be sure that we're standing there. And so again, if you've got any issues or any questions or you think of something during the week, contact me, let me know. Love your feedback. If you agree, disagree, just feel free to approach me and we'll see what we can do about working that out. So we're about to go into our song service. It'll take us just a couple of minutes to get everything swapped over, and then we'll begin the next.